All right. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, all right. So, okay. Well, thank you for hopping on. I always feel different about doing these sort of virtual type trainings. I appreciate y'all being willing. So, so I am Cole Warner, and I am the digital health program manager for Hospice of Davidson County. But I also run our grief counseling and bereavement department. And the reason we're doing this virtually today is I work remotely. So a lot of the stuff that I do is behind the scenes for our organization. So I appreciate you all being willing to watch me on a TV instead of seeing me in person. I have a little PowerPoint here that I'm just going to keep to myself because I find it better if you can see me and that way I can see everybody else. But just know that I have a little PowerPoint to keep me going here. The reason that we like to do these types of talks and presentations is in our society, grief is one of those things that everybody goes through, but a lot of people have a hard time talking about. And what I mean by talking about it is it's one thing to talk about, going to a funeral, knowing somebody that had a maybe cancer for a long time and died from it. But it's another thing to talk about sort of how that affects us on a day-to-day basis. One of the reasons that it's difficult is that sometimes it carries with it a lot of painful, I would say, psychological stress, right? Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the physical stress and look at grief as a stressor, because I think that can be helpful in when we're quote unquote coping with stress, what that looks like for us. So that's sort of how we'll look at it for today. And if you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or just shout at me. That's fine as well. I try not to talk too long and ramble on, but it can be difficult. So thank you for bearing with it. So the reason that I want to talk about grief as a stressor is in psychology, we talk about grief as being a major life stressor. And what does that exactly mean? A major life stressor is just one of those things that is a non-normative or a uncontrollable event, right? And the reason that it's important to look at it this way is because it activates the same response from your body as, say, divorce or as losing a job or something in your life that feels uncontrollable. And in fact, it's sort of kind of the idea that it's outside of our ability to handle. Now, the great thing about us is we are able to handle it, but in the moment, right in the beginning, it feels like we don't have the ability or the resources to handle it. If you've lost someone recently, you probably can relate to the idea that I just can't handle this. I hear, when I work with clients, that's one of the first things that I always hear. I just don't know how I'm going to do this or handle this, right? And that's us sort of speaking for answers and reaching for solutions to sort of what we're going through. And if we look at it as a stressor, then we can talk about how our brains and our bodies respond to the response, right? And so has anyone ever, and I guess I'll ask a question, hopefully we can unmute here. Has anyone experienced what they would consider to be almost like a mini panic attack in their grief? If you can just raise your hand, or if you don't want to, you can not, that's fine. Okay, yeah. So one of the things that if you have anxiety or you've ever had a panic attack, you know that your whole body feels like it's, some people describe it as sort of ramping up, right? And you feel like you're losing sort of control of what's going on. Grief can have a similar response, and you'll hear sometimes people call them grief attacks and things. And one of the reasons is your body has a response to either that psychological thing that's going on in your head, whether it's like an intrusive thought thinking about your loved one or something that memories do it a lot for people, right? Because memories are so intertwined with our body's response. But sort of you think of those things, right, and it activates. It can increase your heart rate. It can release your stress hormone into your body, right? And cause this nervous system reaction to the thoughts in your head, right? And that stressor takes a toll on us. There are links from grief stress to heart attack, stroke, chronic illness, and even death, right? Especially, sort of depending on your previous health, right? And so some of the coping that we're going to talk about today targets directly not only at the psychological symptoms of grief, but at reducing those physical symptoms. I'm going to be the person on here today that tells you that exercise is helpful, right? I'm sure that you've all visited your doctor or whatever and heard that exercise is good for you. I'm going to tell you exactly why it's helpful for grief. Because, when you are grieving, there's probably lots of people there to support you and to hear you talk about, and hopefully there to share memories and things that help you process that psychologically. But the second half of that is the sort of the physical response. Okay. Just pull my PowerPoint here and make sure I keep going. I do something like this every other week with a specific group. And I used to pull up the PowerPoint for them. And then I realized that I don't think anyone was actually listening to me, and they were just reading my poorly done PowerPoint. So that's another reason I keep it down. Okay, so some of the systems that I just want to say real quick that grief has an effect on that we're going to talk about coping with is the autonomic nervous system and the cardiovascular system. And we won't go into that much other than to say that grief creates a physical activation in us, right? And so sometimes you hear people talk about a grief process that can take 2 years. I'm not saying that we're activated that long, but if I can ask you to think for a second, from the losses in your life, has there been a time where you felt overcome and overwhelmed with emotion in an instant, not even saw it coming? Maybe it was driving by a specific place, talking to a specific person, somebody saying a specific thing, and you just feel that activation, right? And it actually can take us a bit to sort of calm down for that. And some people that have real issues in terms of calming down, they seek a grief counselor or something like that, because in the moment, it's really, really distressing, if you've ever experienced that, to have that happen. And so it can be really helpful, to talk with someone about how to reduce that. And I'm going to give you a couple tips on here, as we go through. For cognitive processing, I'll just say this. I'm sure you've all have heard of the 5 stages of grief, right? Most everyone knows about that. I'm going to talk a little different about something called the dual process model of processing your grief, because I think it links with the physical symptoms that you feel. Hopefully, everyone's plugged in with a social support system, whether it's their church, whether it's friends, family, because a lot of the things that they say, the encouraging words, hit at this dual process model of grief, which is the idea that we have loss-oriented activities and we have restoration-oriented activities. So loss-oriented activity after a death would be something like a funeral or a celebration of life, right? Something that targets at you grieving that loss of that person. Whereas a restoration-oriented activity would be when people say, and I hate this phrase, so I'll quote it and promise not to repeat it again, but moving on, right? You'll hear people talk about that, right? It's not a great choice of words, because it grief and loss isn't something you disconnect from and move on from. But what those types of activities do represent are creating new identities. So if you've lost a spouse, one of the first things that you can feel is an identity loss. I'm no longer a spouse, right? I'm no longer a mother or a father, or I'm no longer a son or a daughter, right? And so you have to sort of come up with a new identity. Now, I would tell you that your connection through that relationship is still valid, right? And it's something that you can still hold on to, but it can feel like that is very distant, right? And so a restoration oriented activity would be helping you to develop a new identity, right? I worked with somebody who lost their spouse, and then they became a leader. Sort of, they took their thing and became a leader in helping other people who had also lost their spouses, right? And sort of use their experience to be helpful to other people. Well, that experience there is a restoration oriented activity, right? They took that identity that they had lost and created a new one in helping other people work through their grief. And so if you have these two sort of activities that we do, these loss oriented that are very much personal and directed at our own loss, versus restoration oriented activities, which are directed towards basically developing new identities, ways of carrying on, right? Those types of things. Then those really help with our physical grieving, right? Not only the psychological, which that's what they're geared towards, but they also help with the physical grieving. Because if we're using our support network and we're finding our own quote unquote coping strategies, then we're working both of those sort of that sort of model there. All right, I've rambled a lot. Any questions so far, or anything people want to, any comments? Okay.
I think we're good.
All right. So if we're talking about our physical, if we're talking about grief physically as a symptom or a set of symptoms and how it affects each of us, then the strategies for working through that are going to be just as individualized. You know, I think it's very easy. I talked about exercise. It's very easy to just use that word. Well, what does that mean, and what's the purpose of it, right? And what does that mean for you or for me or for anybody? So I'm going to talk about what strategies do for us, because every person is going to find what works for them best. And really a lot of things. So coping, if you ever hear the word coping, it's a very broadly defined word. If you've ever seen a counselor or a psychologist or anything like that. And really what it is it's psychological and behavioral strategies or skills to manage the physical or psychological demands of a situation, right? So if we're talking about grief, coping with grief is activities directly related to helping us process and work through what we're experiencing in our loss, right? And so I've had clients that they can't go to work because they have these emotional crying, they would describe them as outbursts that prevented them from being able to work, right? They literally just couldn't go because they'd have to be sent home, right? Because they just couldn't control themselves. And as much as I would love to just talk to that person and say, well, I'm going to make it so that you no longer cry or you no longer feel sad and the reason that you need to cry, right? That would be great. I would be way richer than I am. And I've written a lot of books if I could do that for people, right? So, but we can come up with coping strategies that would help him or her in the moment bring down their emotional response so that they can get through the day, work, and pay their bills, right? Because that's what was important. It's important for them to grieve, and it was important for them to get to work and pay their bills. So what we do, in this particular case, what we did was come up with ways of psychologically processing the memories and the triggers, right? So for them, it was specific topics of conversation that would really kind of trigger the emotional response. And so we came up with ways in the moment to take 5 minutes to express that and sort of tuck that away so that later on they could revisit that and help process that, right? Exercise or movement, or you hear some people will talk about things like meditation and things. what it does is it calms that nervous system response. So, I'm sure that you've had lots of people that have said very helpful things to you about your grief, and you've probably had people that have said unhelpful things to you. And that also is different for each person, right? What's helpful and what's unhelpful. But it can be very upsetting in the moment when somebody who maybe you respect or is close to you says something that is hurtful about your loved one. Some people, I hear this a lot, that everyone around them is afraid to talk about the person that died, right? That they don't want to upset you. So everyone's, tiptoeing around, not saying something that might upset you, when in fact that in itself is upsetting, right? Because you feel like that you're not allowed to talk about them, or you're not allowed to express that, right? And so when you feel like that in the moment, finding a way to calm your nerves and bring down that physical response can be incredibly helpful in whatever situation that is. I hope that makes sense. So we'll kind of talk about it in that sense. So I recommend that if you are, especially within the first year of losing somebody, I recommend everybody, and I'll call it journaling, and I know that probably sounds cliche, but everybody takes note of how they handle their grief. Because when you are faced with, as you move down the line in your grief process, one of the things that can be helpful is understanding where you've been, right? And so some people, when you're in 2 to 3 years of grief or a grief process, you may feel like you're not doing any better. And I always, when I work with clients, I always like to go back to those notes to say, well, look at how you dealt with it 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and see where you've come now, right? And that can be helpful for people to reflect back on that. And even when you get that sort of physical response to, we'll call it emotional response, right? It can be helpful to remind yourself of that you do have the ability to handle this because you've come so far, right? You've been in it for a year or 2 years or however long. The second thing that I'll bring up is behavioral. So I will be the person that preaches that healthy habits are I think a lot of times we don't realize the effect that they have on our grieving, right? And it's tough, and it's easy to sit on the other side of the camera or the other side of the room when you're not the one grieving the loss and say, you need to be around other people, right? It's important. Well, so we know that our social network is the biggest indicator of how we are going to deal with grief or death or loss, right? So it's the biggest indicator. It doesn't mean that if we don't have a social network that we can't make it through, but it is true that is the largest indicator. And that is because those relationships never take the place of the loss, but what they do is they're constant reminders, and we're social creatures as humans. So they're constant interactions that we get to have that sort of fulfill that social piece. Now, especially, some of the clients that I work with that they were maybe married 40, 50, 60 years and they lose a spouse, that's really difficult to replace, right? And no one should really ever ask you to say, well, just get over that, right? Because that's over. I always tell people that, especially if I'm seeing someone early on after their loss, maybe they lost someone 3 or 4 months ago and they were married to somebody or with somebody for 40 years. 3 months compared to 40 years is a drop in the bucket, right? And so the fact that you're still having a really difficult time grieving the loss of a spouse, of a child, of a parent, it is not surprising. And anybody that says any different, it is just not thinking, right? Because 6, 8, 8 months, a year, 2 years is really nothing compared to those relationships. So a lot of the work that we do in terms of that emotional piece is trying to stick with that connection that I'm referring to there, with the length of the relationship, the qualities of it, what it brought us, the identity that we had there. and that leads into those restoration and loss oriented activities. So the last thing sort of that I'll wrap up with on this is the combined, what I consider to be combined. Both they help us emotionally and they help us physically with that physical response, and that's where those things like the exercise and things come in. And that can be, I had a lovely client. She lost her husband. I think they were married for 37 years, and she lost her husband to cancer. And every day she started taking these walks on their property, and what she started doing was tracking the birds that she saw on these walks, right? And they met these birds to her and her husband. He loved them before he died, and he loved birds. And so she would track these birds and she would talk to these birds like she was talking to her husband. And I felt so bad because she had a friend that told her she was crazy. That's the quote, crazy for talking to birds, right? And I will tell you that she could tell you that she wasn't actually, that he wasn't the birds, right? But that it brought her peace to speak to them like she was speaking to her husband, right? It brought her connection and peace. So I'm here to tell you she wasn't crazy for that. But what she did was she combined, so that was huge emotional processing. That was an hour that she kept to herself, you know, that she took to connect with her grief and with her husband. But it also was reducing the physical effects of the grief and stress that she was going through, right? Just by getting out and walking for an hour each day, she was lowering all the long-term effects that stress was having on her body, because her body was able to calm down and not be activated all the time. And this talk is really geared towards those moments when you feel very activated, because it's very easy. I won't say it's very easy. It's one thing to process your grief in a counselor's office or to talk with friends and loved ones about the person that passed. It's another thing when you feel overwhelmed about it in the moment, and it's really difficult to bring that back down. And so so this PowerPoint I have has some notes with it. I'm going to share it with the Senior Center, and they can print out, and it's got some resources on the last slide for everybody that you can go to, websites that have different things. But the sort of the point of this was hopefully that you recognize that that grief is a stress reaction, and we don't often think of it that way. So if you're not thinking it that way, it is having that effect on your body. And so the things that you do to work through your grief, emotionally are great, but you also want to make sure that you pay attention, get out and exercise, use that as a way to lower sort of that emotional activation that happens when you feel overwhelmed, and lower the effect that it has on us, because stress activation or having all of that going on with you is linked to some pretty significant health issues later on. So questions or topic, comments of discussion, anything like that.
Anybody got anything?
Yeah.
What if you can't get over the death of a loved one after so many years?
Yeah. So that's a great question. One of the things that I think, and I would say it sort of depends on what you mean on getting over. I would say that if you feel like you're not emotionally in a better place, after a year or 2 years in any way, then you probably need to seek help, because one of the things that we know, it's interesting, the work that say I do as a grief counselor, a lot of the times it's I like to think of it as targeted at specific symptoms, right? Not that, it's not like grief is a medical issue to just get over, but there are specific symptoms that might be very difficult, right? But when you feel like still a sense of loss of meaning and purpose, right? Like that's something specifically that people can work on, and you can seek help for, right? And that can be a little bit more, that can take a lot longer than, say, the example I used earlier where this person couldn't go to work because of their emotional sort of activation at work, right? Well, that was a very specific thing that we actually were able to solve pretty quickly within a few weeks, right? Whereas a feeling of loss of meaning and purpose, that can take a lot longer and may even need, outside help. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anybody else got anything?
You've been told her not to say nothing.
I think it's more mentally than physically.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I try to think about the things, and unfortunately, it's hard for me to, not knowing anything about a situation or anything like that, to say, but I would say that the psychological issues, they never truly go away, but that doesn't mean that they have to be so difficult to work through that you find living every day to be a hard task, right?
Yeah.
That's what I always tell people. If getting up and waking up every day for 3 months is hard, that's difficult, but it's something we can deal with. If we're doing it for 3 years, man, that's really difficult, and you probably really need to talk with someone about that. Yes.
If walking and exercising is difficult at this point, are there other things that you can do?
Yeah. So this is where, and actually, I very briefly mentioned it. I didn't talk about it too much. Like some people call it mindfulness or meditation. It actually has similar effects, right? So there are all sorts of apps out there. Say Calm, the Calm app is one. I think Headspace is the other. That they are more breathing and focus directed activities that you don't actually have to be able to get up and move around to be able to do, and they actually have the same effect on the body. So they are going to calm that nervous system and lower your stress levels in the moment. Thank you for asking that question. I didn't spend as much time on that. Absolutely.
Now, why is it that grief lasts so long?
Well, I would ask you, so that's I wish I had the great answer to that question. I guess what I would say is that a lot of people think that when someone dies, that is the finality of the connection. And what I would submit to you is that, yeah, death is final, right? And depending on your religious beliefs, heaven, right? And you believe in an afterlife and all that. And that's very final. But the connection and the relationships and the memories that you share with somebody, that isn't, right? And so, I have people that they'll call the person's phone for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years after, because it's how they connected with them, right? And so that's what I would say, that there's not a great answer for emotional connection and grief in terms of how long it's going to take you to process your grief. There's no one that's come up with the formula that says, answer these 10 questions and I'll tell you exactly how long it'll take you to emotionally process that grief. Does that make sense?
Yes.
What you got? What you got, Mary?
My husband has been dead for 21 years. When it first happened, I actually could not eat. I got down to right at 100 pounds.
Yeah.
In the 21 years that I have worked on it, and people tell you, well, just get over it or you'll get over it, I haven't found that to be true. What I have found is that I am able to cope with his loss, with not having him in the house, and sometimes I still talk to his picture.
Yeah.
And I still remember him, and I'm happy that I had him, and I don't want somebody else. But that's just me. I don't know how to explain it, but I've managed to learn how to put one foot in front of the other, but it never goes away.
Yeah. Well, so to talk about the appetite, yeah, that's a huge issue, and that's always one that we try to. That's a specific symptom that I always try to work with people on if they have that. But the other thing that you mentioned there was, I often ask clients, especially in their hardest point of grief, if I could take that person out of your life that they never existed, and that would take this grief away, would you choose that? And I've never had a client say yes, right? So as much as that grief is painful and difficult to work through, I've never had a client tell me, yeah, I would have just preferred they never been in my life, right? That's never happened. Because that sort of that grief is the reflection of who they were to you in life, right?
All right. Anybody else? Anything? Okay. All right. I think we're good.
Okay. Well, thank you for hanging in with me and listening to me. Hopefully you took something from it.
Yeah. And if you'll send me that PowerPoint or
Yes.
if you want
Yep.
to email it, that's fine. I'll definitely print it out for everybody.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much.